A U.S. plane carrying another shipment of military equipment and munitions has landed in Ukraine amid heightened tensions between the West and Russia. Ukraine's defense minister says this is the third batch of U.S. weapons to arrive in the capital, Kiev, and is part of a $200 million security package pledged by Washington to Kiev. Several NATO members such as Britain, Spain, Denmark, and the Netherlands have already sent consignments of weapons and warships to the region amid tensions with Russia over Ukraine. The West is accusing Moscow of intending to attack Ukraine by massing troops along its border. Russia denies the claim and says the move is defensive amid its concerns over NATO's eastward expansion and military activities near its border. Joining us now from London is Marcus Papadopoulos, historian and political analyst and author. Hello, Mr. Papadopoulos. Always a pleasure to check in with you here on Press TV, sir. Your thoughts why, if the U.S. is sincere that it wants to diffuse tensions with Russia, why it keeps sending more weapons to Ukraine?
Well, the decision of the Americans to increase their supply of weaponry to Ukraine is an inevitable one, because whilst Washington will not go to war with Russia over Ukraine, nonetheless, the Americans are hoping that by increasing the supply of weapons to the Ukrainian armed forces, this will deter Russia from taking military action in Ukraine, which will mean that America's foothold in the country will be preserved. Because we must not forget that ever since the American engineered coup in Kiev in February of 2014 against the democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, which saw him replaced by a pro-Western and fervently anti-Russian government, Ukraine has been in the West's sphere of influence, politically, economically, culturally, and militarily. So that is why the Americans, together with the British, are rapidly increasing the amount of weaponry which they are sending to Ukraine. They are doing so to preserve, to defend, to maintain their foothold in Ukraine, because the West is striving for Ukraine to one day become a member of NATO. And in such a scenario, Russia would be encircled on its western border by NATO member states, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. But that all said, however, no matter how many weapons the Americans and the British send to the Ukrainian armed forces, should Russia decide to take military action of some kind in Ukraine, those weapons will amount to nothing, because the Ukrainian armed forces are overwhelmingly staffed by soldiers and officers from the westernmost part of the country. It is only in the westernmost part of the country, regions such as Volyn, Rivne, Ternopol, and Ivano-Frankivsk, where there is anti-Russian sentiment. The rest of Ukraine, from Kharkov to Dnipropetrovsk, to Mariupol, to Zaporizhia, to Kherson, to Odessa, to Kiev, view Russia as an intrinsic part of their heritage. Millions of Ukrainians outside the westernmost part of Ukraine identify themselves as part of the Russian world. Most Ukrainians are members of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. So in the event of Russian military action in Ukraine, which is very possible, the country will collapse. The Ukrainian armed forces will collapse, because large parts of the country in the east, in the south, and in the center would welcome the Russian army. They would welcome them as liberators. There would be very similar scenes to what they were seen back in 1943 and 1944, when the Red Army began the process of liberating Soviet Ukraine. So it doesn't matter what the Americans and the British send to the Ukrainian armed forces. If Russia decides very soon to take military action, the Ukrainian armed forces will be decimated, and Ukraine and much of the Ukrainian population will rejoice in that.
And if that's the case, then Marcus, why isn't the West? Because to your point, I mean, it's not the Ukraine for the last near a decade has been crying that Russia is going to invade us. We need weapons from the West. They never got those weapons. They got a lot of promises. Now they're finally getting some batches of weapons. But let's put that aside and go back to your ultimate point right now that you just made before I brought the second question to you. If this is the case, we have a divided Ukraine that's pretty much a weakened, divided Ukraine militarily. Why isn't the West taking more practical steps to try to diffuse tensions along that Ukrainian border?
Well, since when has the West had an aversion to conflict? How many wars has the West started in the last 30 years? It was the West that carried out an illegal bombing campaign against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. It was the West who illegally invaded Iraq. It was the West who exceeded its mandate in Libya. And it was the West that supplied weaponry to terrorist groups in Syria. So the West has no aversion to conflict. But what I believe is the case is that the Americans now understand that the Russian military, buoyed on by its emphatic success in Syria, is ready to take action in Ukraine. Because I have long described Ukraine as constituting Russia's soft underbelly. Under no circumstances will the Kremlin countenance Ukrainian membership of NATO. So I believe that the Americans are desperate to maintain their foothold in Ukraine, and they are doing that they are doing that in the hope of sending more and more military equipment to Ukraine. But the Americans and the British are putting out falsehoods about Ukraine. There is no such thing as a Ukrainian people. There is no such thing as a Ukrainian national identity. Ukraine is a highly regionalized country, which is largely a product of the Soviet period. So many people in the Odessa region or in the Kharkov region identify themselves with Odessa or Kharkov as opposed to Ukraine. And as I said moments ago, millions of Ukrainians identify themselves as part of the Russian world. If you take a visit to Kharkov or to Odessa or to Nikolaev, and if you ask people there on the ground, which Western mainstream media will never do, if you ask people there on the ground in the aforementioned cities what their views are on Russia, they will never say that Russia is an alien country. They will never say that Russia is hostile. They regard Russians as their own people. Ukrainians and Russians and Belarusians are East Slavs. They are members of the Moscow Patriarchate. So the West is fooling its own people by the Ukrainian people, and there is no such thing as a Ukrainian people, that the Ukrainian people will fight to the death against a Russian invasion. People in the westernmost regions of Ukraine, they will fight to the death, but that is a very small part of the country. And those regions such as Lvov, Volyn and Rivne, prior to September of 1939, had never been a part of Russia. They had been ruled by the Poles, then the Austrians, and then the Poles again. So that is why fierce anti-Russians in the westernmost part of Ukraine. But that part of Ukraine aside, the rest of Ukraine regards Russia as a brotherly nation. They regard themselves as part of the Russian world. And there will not be in places like Odessa or Kharkov should the Russians launch a military campaign of some kind.
Thank you, Marcus. We always learn so much when we check in with you. Stay safe, but thanks for joining us on the program. From London, Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos there joining us.